The rain had been falling over Manhattan for 3 hours without stopping. The kind of cold, relentless November rain that soaks through your coat before you even reach the door, that turns the yellow cabs into blurs of light against black asphalt, that makes the whole city feel like it is being slowly erased. From the 14th floor of Meridian Medical Center on the Upper East Side, the skyline looked like a painting left out in a storm. The glass was fogged at the edges, and the lights of the buildings across the park bled into each other, soft and indistinct, like memories you can no longer hold clearly in your mind. Richard Sterling was awake. He had been awake since 2 in the morning, which was not unusual anymore. Sleep had become something that happened to other people. He lay in the adjustable bed, the finest private room the hospital offered, with its cream walls and brushed steel fixtures and a dedicated nursing station just outside, and he stared at the ceiling with the particular stillness of a man who has run out of things to do with his hands. The television was off. He had tried watching it earlier and found that he could not concentrate on anything for more than a few minutes. His phone sat on the bedside table. The screen had gone dark 40 minutes ago after his last email, a brief response to his assistant about a board meeting he would not be attending. No calls had come in since 6 in the evening. No one had texted to ask how the night was going. He was 72 years old and had spent the last 4 decades building Sterling Capital Group into one of the most consequential private investment firms in the United States. He had offices in Manhattan, Chicago, San Francisco, and London. He had appeared on the covers of financial publications. He had shaken hands with 3 presidents. He had a net worth that placed him comfortably in the upper tier of any wealth ranking you cared to name. And on this rainy Tuesday night in November, in the most expensive private room in one of Manhattan's most prestigious hospitals, he had not received a single personal phone call. Not one. The disease had announced itself 8 months earlier with symptoms he had initially dismissed. Fatigue, he attributed to age. A persistent discomfort in his abdomen, he attributed to stress. By the time Dr. Emily Parker had finished reviewing his scans and sat across from him in her office with the careful stillness of a person choosing their words with great precision, the diagnosis was already past the stage where the word manageable applied without reservation. Treatable, yes, she had said. Controlled with the right protocol. But this is something we are going to be watching very closely, Mr. Sterling. He had nodded and asked about the timeline for returning to full work capacity. That was his first question. Not what does this mean for my life? Not should I call my sons? Not is there something I should be doing differently starting today? His first question was about returning to full work capacity. He thought about that now, lying in the dim room, listening to the rain against the glass. On the table beside his phone, there was a small framed photograph that a nurse had retrieved from his apartment at his request. It was a family photograph, decades old, taken at a house in Connecticut. Richard was in it, younger, thinner, with more hair and a confident smile. Standing beside him was a woman named Margaret, who had been his wife for 11 years before the marriage ended quietly and without much drama, which he had at the time considered a reasonable outcome. In front of them were 2 boys, Michael and Christopher. Michael would have been about 12 in the photograph. Christopher, 8. Richard could not remember the occasion. Some holiday, probably. He could not remember who took the picture or what happened afterward, or whether it was a good day. He had found the photograph in a drawer of his home office approximately 3 years ago while looking for a contract document, and he had placed it back in the drawer without thinking much about it. It was only after arriving at the hospital that he had asked for it to be brought to him. He did not know exactly why. He picked it up now, held it at arm's length, and looked at the faces of those 2 boys. Michael was 42 now. He worked in finance, naturally, had built a competent career inside a competing firm, and visited his father at the hospital approximately once every 10 days, which was more than Christopher, who lived in Portland and had found a way to be unavailable for most of the last decade. Michael's visits were brief and largely practical. He would sit across from Richard, discuss whatever was happening at Sterling Capital, ask the doctor a few pointed questions, and leave. There was nothing cold about it. Precisely. It was simply the temperature that had existed between them for so long that neither of them remembered when it had first set in. Richard set the photograph down. He reached for the cup of water on the table, took a sip, and then simply held the cup in both hands because it was warm and it gave him something to hold. He was thinking, as he had been thinking more and more in these quiet hours, about the nature of a particular kind of loneliness. Not the loneliness of being physically alone, which was manageable and could be addressed by calling a driver or scheduling a meeting or walking into a restaurant and ordering something expensive. He had managed that variety for most of his adult life with little difficulty. What he was thinking about was the other kind. The loneliness that exists when you are surrounded by people who know your name and your net worth and the square footage of your apartment but do not know and have never asked what you are afraid of, what you regret, what you would do differently if the clock were rewound to a specific year and you were given the chance to make a different set of choices. Nobody in his life had ever asked him those questions. He was not sure he would have known how to answer them if they had. The door to his room opened, and a nurse named Patricia stepped in to check his vitals. She was efficient and pleasant, and moved with the quiet competence of someone who had been doing this work for many years. She adjusted the monitoring cuff, noted his readings on the tablet, asked if he needed anything, and when he said no, she nodded and moved toward the door. "Patricia," he said. She turned. "Is it always this quiet here at night?" She tilted her head slightly, as though the question surprised her. "Mostly, yes," she said. "Some rooms have more visitors in the evening, families that come after work, but it tends to quiet down by 8 or 9. He nodded slowly. "Your son called earlier," she said, "while you were resting. He left a message at the nurse's station that he'll be by Thursday." "Thank you," Richard said. She left. He sat with Thursday for a moment. 3 days away. He had once run a company where decisions were made by the hour, and deals were negotiated across multiple time zones simultaneously. Now he was tracking the days between visits. He closed his eyes, but he did not sleep. 3 floors below, in a corridor near the elevator bank, the doors opened and Daniel Carter stepped in from the rain. He was 59 years old, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped gray hair and the unhurried movements of a man who had learned long ago that rushing rarely changed outcomes. He wore a dark olive jacket, the kind with a worn collar that has been washed too many times, and he was carrying a paper bag from a deli 2 blocks over. Water ran off the shoulders of the jacket, and he shook the rain from his hands before approaching the reception desk. "Good evening," he said to the woman at the desk, his voice low and easy. "I'm here to visit Thomas Whitfield, room 1108. The receptionist checked the visitor log, confirmed the name, printed a visitor badge, and pointed him toward the elevators. Daniel thanked her, clipped the badge to his jacket, and headed down the corridor. He was not a man who needed to announce himself in a room. He had spent 2 decades in the United States Army, eventually reaching the rank of Master Sergeant, and had served in deployments that took him to places he still did not discuss in detail at dinner tables or social gatherings, not because he was secretive, but because he had found that the people who hadn't been there usually filled in the details with things they had seen in movies, and he preferred accuracy to drama. He had come home from his final deployment 14 years ago, received his honorable discharge, and spent the years since doing various forms of work that mostly involved being useful to people who needed something a trained, patient, observant man could provide. Currently, he volunteered twice a week with a nonprofit organization that connected veterans with support services, including regular hospital visits to veterans undergoing medical treatment. Thomas Whitfield was a fellow veteran, 71 years old, recovering from a hip replacement, and Daniel had been visiting him every few days for the past 3 weeks, bringing food from the deli because Thomas had complained that the hospital meals tasted like cardboard dampened with lukewarm water. He stepped off the elevator on the 11th floor and turned left down the corridor. He passed room 1114, then 1112, slowing as he approached 1110. Through the open door of 1110, he could see a nurse adjusting monitoring equipment for a patient who appeared to be sleeping. He kept walking. Through the half-open door of the room labeled 1108, he could already hear the television, which meant Thomas was awake and had found something worth watching. But as he passed the room numbered 1116 on the opposite side of the corridor, something made him slow down. He was not sure afterward how to explain it. The door was mostly closed, but not entirely, and through the gap he could see the edge of a hospital bed and the shape of a man sitting upright against the pillows in the amber glow of a bedside lamp. The man was not watching television. He was not reading. He was not on his phone. He was simply sitting there, holding a cup of water, staring at nothing in particular, in the particular posture of a person who has been alone for a long time. Daniel stopped. He had seen that posture before. He had seen it in hospital wards overseas. He had seen it in veterans' centers. He had seen it in the faces of men who had spent long stretches of their lives operating at maximum intensity, and then arrived, one day, at a stopping point, and discovered that they did not know how to exist without forward motion. He stood in the corridor for a moment, then he knocked gently on the doorframe. The man inside looked up. "Sorry to bother you," Daniel said. "I just wanted to make sure you were all right." The man looked at him for a long moment. His eyes were sharp, gray-green, the eyes of a person who had spent a lifetime reading rooms and calculating the angles of situations. He looked Daniel over with the habitual assessment of someone who had learned early that strangers generally want something. "I'm fine," the man said. His voice was steady and slightly rough, the voice of a man who had spent decades in boardrooms projecting authority. "All right," Daniel said. He did not move. A beat passed. "You can come in if you want," the man said. He said it as though he was not entirely sure why he was saying it. Daniel stepped inside. He set his paper bag down on the chair near the door and pulled the chair slightly closer to the bed. Not too close. A comfortable conversational distance. And he sat down. "Daniel Carter," he said. "Richard Sterling. You a patient here, Richard?" "I am." A pause. "Do you know who I am?" Daniel looked at him steadily. "Should I?" Something shifted in the older man's expression. It was subtle, a slight loosening around the jaw, a fractional adjustment in the set of his shoulders. But Daniel, who had spent a career reading people in high-pressure situations, noticed it. "Most people do," Richard said. "Well," Daniel said, "I spend most of my time with veterans. They tend not to be much impressed by names." Richard looked at him. "You a veteran?" 22 years, Army. You?" Richard shook his head. "No, I went straight into finance." "Interesting work?" "Once," Richard said. "Very much so." Daniel nodded. "Mind if I stay a few minutes? I'm visiting a friend down the hall, but I've got a little time." Richard looked at the cup in his hands, then back at Daniel. "No," he said. "I don't mind." And so Daniel Carter sat down in the chair beside the most powerful man he had ever met, whom he did not know was powerful, in a hospital room in Manhattan on a rainy November night, and simply began to talk. The first conversation lasted 40 minutes. Daniel had intended to stay for 10. He would check in briefly, make sure the man was comfortable, then head down the hall to Thomas, who would already be wondering about his pastrami sandwich. But something about the quality of the silence in room 1116 made him stay longer than he planned, and by the time he stood up to leave, the rain outside had shifted from a hard driving fall to something steadier and quieter, the kind of rain that settles in for the night. They had talked about nothing dramatic. That was the thing Daniel reflected on later, walking back to the parking garage with his collar turned up against the cold. They had not talked about Richard's illness, or his diagnosis, or the particular medical protocols that Dr. Parker had outlined in crisp clinical language, that Richard had absorbed and filed away without actually processing. They had talked about the city, about a restaurant on the west side of Midtown that Daniel occasionally visited for Sunday breakfast, about the way Manhattan felt different in November than in any other month, stripped of its summer energy, quieter in a way that made it feel more honest. Daniel had mentioned growing up in Baltimore, and Richard had mentioned spending time in Baltimore during his early career, and they had compared impressions of the city with the easy specificity of two people who know a place from the inside, rather than from photographs. Richard had not laughed during the conversation, but he had smiled twice. Small, genuine smiles, the kind that appear without intention. When Daniel said goodnight and told him he would be back on Thursday to visit Thomas again, Richard said only, "All right." But there was something in the way he said it, a slight care, a precise neutrality, that told Daniel the man was trying not to sound like he was looking forward to it. Daniel filed that away. He visited Thomas for an hour, delivered the pastrami sandwich, listened to a lengthy account of a dispute Thomas was conducting with a physical therapist over the correct pace of his recovery, offered an opinion that Thomas immediately disagreed with, and left at 9:30 with the comfortable feeling of having been useful. On the drive home to his apartment in the Bronx, he thought about the man in room 1116. He had placed people into situations and read their characteristics for more than 2 decades, and one of the things he had learned was that loneliness wore different costumes depending on the life of the person wearing it. In men who had grown up without resources, loneliness often announced itself directly, in words, in an openness about need. In men who had spent their lives in positions of authority and control, it came out sideways, in the particular way they held themselves in a room, in the over-deliberateness of their composure, in the way they looked at you, a half-second too long, when you said something that happened to be kind. Richard Sterling had that look. Daniel did not know who the man was. He had not Googled the name. He would do that later, after getting home, and he would sit for a moment at his kitchen table looking at the search results with the specific feeling of a person discovering that a conversation they thought was simple was, in fact, considerably more layered than it appeared. But that night, driving through the wet streets of the Bronx, he did not yet know. He knew only that a man in his 70s was lying in a hospital room on the Upper East Side with nobody to talk to, and that the man had visibly, physically relaxed once someone sat down beside him and treated him like an ordinary person. That was enough. On Thursday, Daniel arrived at Meridian Medical Center at 4:30 in the afternoon. He visited Thomas first. Protocol and loyalty both demanded it, and spent 45 minutes there. Then he knocked on the door of room 1116. Richard was sitting up in bed with a financial newspaper on his lap. But Daniel noticed that the newspaper appeared to be at the same page as it had been on the previous visit. Richard looked up when he knocked and put the paper aside with the slightly self-conscious speed of a man who has been caught doing nothing. "Carter," he said. "Sterling," Daniel said. He pulled the chair to the same position as before and sat down. This time, he brought 2 coffees from the hospital's ground-floor cafe, the better of the 2 coffee sources in the building, a fact he had established through brief but purposeful inquiry with Patricia at the nurse's station. He set 1 cup on the table beside Richard's bed. Richard looked at the cup. "You brought me coffee?" "Hospital coffee, so lower your expectations accordingly," Daniel said. "But it's hot." Richard picked it up, took a sip. His expression registered something between mild surprise and careful pleasure. "It's decent." "High praise from a man with your resources," Daniel said. Richard glanced at him. "You Googled me." "I did. And I came back anyway," Daniel said. "Which should tell you something." Richard was quiet for a moment, holding the cup. Then something changed in his face, a slight softening, a fractional drop in the wall he maintained behind his eyes. "Most people come back because of what they found," he said. "I'm not most people," Daniel said simply. "I'm a retired master sergeant from Baltimore who volunteers at veterans programs. I don't need anything from you, Richard. I just thought you could use some company." The silence between them had a different quality now, less testing. Richard looked out the window, where the November sky was low and pale gray, the kind of sky that promises more cold without promising much else. "My son is coming at 6, he said. "Good. It will be a short visit." Daniel did not respond to that. He let it sit. "He wants to discuss something related to the company," Richard said. "There's a situation involving one of the funds that requires my input. He brings me documents." A pause. "He brought me a card last time. Birthday was 2 weeks ago. Did you enjoy the card?" "It was signed by him and his wife." Richard set the cup down. "She writes neatly." Daniel looked at him steadily for a moment. He had heard this kind of careful, dry understatement from men who had learned not to say plainly what they were feeling because the plain version of the feeling was too large to fit comfortably into regular conversation. "How long has it been like this between you two?" he asked. Richard's jaw tightened slightly. That's a direct question. I ask direct questions, comes with a background. Years, Richard said after a moment. Many years. Since he was young, really. I was not. He paused, selecting the word with what appeared to be genuine effort. Present, in the way that mattered. Work? Work. Deals. Dinners that were also meetings. Trips that were also acquisitions. He looked at the window. His mother and I divorced when he was 15. I did not handle it with any particular grace. What does that mean? It means I continued working at exactly the same pace, and assumed that the financial arrangements I made were sufficient as a form of participation. He stopped. They were not. Daniel nodded slowly. He did not offer reassurance. He did not move to smooth the moment over. He simply let it exist. My daughter calls me every Sunday, Daniel said. Richard looked at him. Sarah, she's 34, teaches elementary school in Queens. He picked up his coffee. We disagree constantly, about everything. She thinks I take on too much volunteering, that I don't rest enough, that I eat at the wrong hours. She calls every Sunday at 10 in the morning, and we argue for about 20 minutes, and then we talk for another 40 minutes about whatever is actually going on in her life. He paused. It's the best part of my week. Richard said nothing for a moment. You were not always close to her, he said. It was not a question. I was away for stretches, Daniel said. Long stretches sometimes, deployments. She grew up with her mother taking the lead. It was hard on both of them. He held the cup. When I came back for the last time, she was 20. She was angry. She had a right to be angry. We had 3 years that were very uncomfortable. What changed? I stopped trying to explain myself, Daniel said. I stopped explaining and started listening. And I showed up. Consistently. Not dramatically. No grand gestures. Just showing up consistently. Over time, doing what I said I was going to do. He looked at Richard. You can rebuild things. It takes longer than you think it should, and it hurts in ways you don't anticipate. But you can rebuild things. Richard was very still. How old is your son? Daniel asked. Michael is 42. So you've got time, Daniel said. Not infinite time, but time. The door opened, and Dr. Emily Parker came in with a tablet and the calm, professional demeanor of a person who has learned to read a room instantly. She registered Daniel's presence with a brief, neutral assessment, then turned her attention to Richard. Good afternoon, Mr. Sterling, she said. I have your updated panel results. She glanced at Daniel with a question in her expression. This is Daniel Carter, Richard said. He's a friend. Dr. Sack. Parker looked at Richard for just a moment longer than she otherwise would have. Nice to meet you, Mr. Carter, she said. Daniel nodded. Doctor. She went through the results with Richard. Professional, precise, thorough. The numbers, she explained, were trending in the direction she had hoped for with the current treatment adjustment. Not dramatically, but measurably. She recommended another imaging appointment at the end of the following week. She answered 2 questions Richard asked with the clear, unambiguous directness that, Daniel noted, Richard responded to well. He asked good questions, the kind that came from actually understanding the information rather than just performing engagement. When she was done, she made a note on her tablet. Then she looked at Daniel again briefly before leaving the room, and he had the impression that she was reconsidering something she had previously concluded, though he could not have said what. She's good, Daniel said after the door closed. The best pancreatic specialist in the state, according to the people I had researched the field, Richard said. Must be a comfort. It is, Richard said. Then quietly. Somewhat? He looked at the window again. The pale gray sky had deepened toward something darker now, the late afternoon collapsing toward early evening at the pace that November managed with particular efficiency. Tell me something, Richard said. You've been in situations where the outcome was uncertain, where things could go a number of different ways and not all of them were good. Many times, Daniel said. What do you do with that? With the uncertainty? Daniel thought about it genuinely, the way he always tried to think about genuine questions, without reaching for the comfortable answer. You figure out what you actually control, he said, which is usually less than you think, and then you focus everything you have on that. The rest, He paused. "The rest you have to make your peace with. Not once. You have to keep making your peace with it. Every day, sometimes." Richard was looking at him with the specific attention of a man hearing something he has not heard before, or has heard in the wrong language and is finally receiving in one he understands. "That is harder than it sounds," Richard said. "Considerably," Daniel agreed. They sat together while the room got darker, and Daniel did not check his watch, and Richard did not reach for his phone, and the quiet between them was not the quiet of two men who had nothing to say to each other, but the quiet of two men who had found, in a way that neither of them had anticipated or planned for, something genuinely worth sitting still for. At 5:50, Daniel stood to leave before Michael arrived, giving Richard the room. He put on his jacket, picked up the paper bag from the deli. "Same time next week?" he said. "I'll be here," Richard said. And there was the same careful neutrality as before, the same deliberate flatness that Daniel now understood was the sound of a man who has learned not to let himself want things. "I know you will," Daniel said. "I'll bring better coffee." He walked out into the corridor, and behind him he could hear the faint sound of Richard Sterling picking up his phone for the first time in hours, not to check his emails but to answer a call. The name on the screen, Daniel did not see. But if he could have, it would have read, Michael. The thing about Michael Sterling was that he had spent 20 years being competent. He was competent at his job, competent in his marriage, competent in his social relationships, competent at being the kind of person who fulfilled his obligations punctually and without drama. He had learned, somewhere in his teens, that competence was the currency his father respected most, and he had pursued it with the single-mindedness of a person trying to earn something that kept not quite arriving. He arrived at Meridian Medical Center at 6:03 on Thursday evening in a charcoal overcoat with his briefcase and a folder of documents that required his father's signature or input or directional guidance. He had also, at his wife's suggestion, stopped at a florist on Lexington and picked up a small arrangement of white flowers, which he now held in his right hand, with the slightly awkward grip of a man who does not regularly carry flowers. Patricia at the nurse's station told him his father had just had a visitor leave about 10 minutes ago. Michael registered this without expression. "A visitor," he said. "A Mr. Carter," Patricia said. "He comes to visit one of the other patients, but has been spending some time with your father as well." Michael nodded, thanked her, and went down the hall. He found his father in an unusual state, which was to say, Richard Sterling appeared when Michael came through the door to be simply sitting, not reviewing documents, not on his phone, not doing the habitual forward-leaning position of a man who is technically resting, but mentally still in a meeting. He was simply sitting, looking at the window, with a small framed family photograph in his hands. Michael stopped in the doorway. Richard looked up. "Michael, Dad." Michael came in, set his briefcase on the chair, and put the flowers on the bedside table with the decisive motion of a person getting an awkward thing out of the way. "Patricia said you had a visitor. Daniel Carter. He volunteers with veterans." Richard set the photograph down carefully. "He's been coming by a few times a week. You know him from before?" "No. He wandered by my room one night and knocked on the door." Richard looked at his son. "He had no idea who I was." Michael processed this, and he kept coming back. Apparently, a silence fell between them that was not unfamiliar. Michael sat down in the chair, opened the folder, and began to explain the situation with the structured credit fund that required Richard's advisory input. And Richard listened and asked 3 sharp, incisive questions, and Michael answered them from memory. He had prepared thoroughly, and between the two of them they resolved the issue within 20 minutes, with the efficient ease of 2 minds that were fundamentally similarly built. Then the folder closed, and the briefcase was latched, and the ordinary purpose of the visit was complete, and neither of them moved to leave. Michael was not sure afterward what made him stay. It might have been the flowers, still in their paper wrapping on the table, which felt like something that should be put in a vase, but he hadn't asked for one. It might have been the photograph, which he had noticed but not yet commented on, and which kept registering at the edge of his attention like something unfinished. That's from the Connecticut house, he said. Richard followed his gaze to the photograph. Yes, I don't remember the occasion. Neither do I, Richard said. Michael looked at it for a moment. The two boys in the photograph. He could not quite access whatever feeling the image was supposed to produce. It felt like looking at a photograph of a family he had been told about but had not been part of, which was not an entirely inaccurate description of the experience. You were probably 8, Richard said. Christopher would have been 4. Christopher isn't coming, Michael said. It was a statement of fact, offered without editorializing. No, Richard said. I called him last week, Michael said. He said he was dealing with some things. He usually is, Richard said. There was no sharpness in it, just a flat acknowledgement of a pattern that had repeated long enough to become simply the way things were. Michael was quiet for a moment. Outside, a bus went by on the street below, its light sweeping briefly across the ceiling. What does this Carter say to you? He asked. When he visits? Richard considered the question seriously. He talks about the army, his experiences there, his daughter, Baltimore. He paused. He asks questions. What kind of questions? The kind people generally don't ask. Richard looked at his son. How I'm actually doing, not medically. Whether I have things I want to say to people. What I think mattered. He stopped. What I think I got wrong. Michael's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly. He was very good at keeping his face still, a skill he had developed young and refined professionally. But something moved underneath it. And what do you tell him? He said, carefully. The truth, Richard said. More of it than I've told most people. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. It had weight and direction, the way silence acquires when a sentence has been spoken that could either be left behind or walked toward. And both people in the room are deciding which. I wasn't there, Richard said, when you were growing up, not in the ways that mattered. I provided everything except the thing that was actually required, which was time and attention. He said it directly, without the softening qualifications he might once have added. The context setting about the pressures of building a company, the reasonableness of his choices given what was available to him, the argument that his financial provision was itself a form of care. He said it without any of that. I missed most of what I should have been there for, and I told myself it would balance out eventually, which it did not do. Michael sat very still. I'm not telling you this to make you feel obligated to say something, Richard said. I'm telling you because Carter seems to think it matters to say it, and he is generally right about things. A man you met 3 weeks ago, Michael said. A man who sits next to me at 10 at night when everyone else has gone home, Richard said. Experience has a way of making itself credible. Michael picked up the flowers from the table, still in their paper wrapping, and turned them in his hands without looking at them. It was the kind of thing you did when your hands needed something to do so the rest of you could think. I didn't know how to talk to you, he said eventually. Growing up, you occupied the whole room, every room you walked into. There wasn't a lot of space to be a kid who wasn't sure what he wanted or what he was doing. A pause. So I learned to talk to you the way you talk to everyone else. About work, about performance, about outcomes. I know, Richard said. It became the only language we had. I know, Richard said again. That is on me. Michael set the flowers down. He rubbed the side of his face with one hand. He was 42 years old, and the last time he had had a conversation with his father that did not involve a business matter or a logistics issue was longer ago than he could specifically identify. There's a vase, he said. Probably. In the cabinet. Richard looked at him. Michael got up, opened the cabinet below the television, found a plastic pitcher, filled it at the sink, and put the flowers in it with the blunt, unsentimental efficiency of a man who has decided to do a thing and is doing it. He set it on the windowsill. Better, he said. He sat back down. They were quiet for a while. It was not a comfortable silence or an uncomfortable one. It was simply a new one. A silence in a new key that neither of them had heard before between themselves, and they were both, in their respective ways, listening to it. Tell me about this, Carter, Michael said. And so Richard did. He described the first night, the rainy Tuesday, The man in the olive jacket appearing at his door, asking if he was all right. He described the coffees, the direct questions, the stories about the army, the daughter who called every Sunday. He described the way Daniel occupied a room, not filling it up the way Richard did, but settling into it, the way something solid settles, quietly and without requiring notice. As he talked, Michael listened with the same focused attention he brought to his professional work, but with a quality his professional attention did not usually carry, which was the quality of someone gathering information that is personally rather than practically relevant. He asked a few questions, clarifying ones, mostly, about what was said and when. At the end of it, he was quiet for a moment. "He doesn't want anything," he said. "Nothing," Richard confirmed. "I have waited for it. I am quite good at identifying the moment when the actual request appears." He looked at his son. "It hasn't?" Michael sat with that. "What does he get out of it then?" "I asked him," Richard said. "He said he gets the same thing he got out of the army. The sense that what he's doing matters to someone. A beat. He also said that sitting with people who are going through hard things is not a sacrifice if you consider the alternative, which is those people going through it alone." Michael was quiet. "He lost friends," Richard said, "in his deployments. Men who died before they had the chance to say what they needed to say, or go back and fix what was broken. I think it changed what he considers worth doing with his time." The room was fully dark now, the window reflecting the pale square of the overhead light and the shapes of the two men sitting in it. Patricia knocked and came in briefly to do a check, registered the son still present with small, visible approval, and withdrew. When the door closed, Michael said, without particular emphasis, almost as a statement of accounting, "I've been here 40 minutes. Richard looked at the clock on the wall. "So you have. That's—" Michael stopped. Started again. "I usually leave after 20. I know. I should get back. Rebecca is—" He stopped again. "Go," Richard said. "It's all right." Michael stood up, picked up his briefcase, and put on his overcoat. He stood for a moment beside the bed, in the way of a person who is not entirely sure whether to do something and is calculating the risk. He put his hand briefly on Richard's arm. Not dramatically. Just a moment of contact, firm and brief, the kind of thing you did between men in his family, when what you felt was larger than the gesture available to you. "Thursday next week," he said. "I'll be here," Richard said. "I know you will." Michael picked up his briefcase. "I'll try to come earlier, before 6. He walked to the door, opened it, stopped, looked back. The flowers were on the windowsill, white against the dark glass. "The Connecticut house," he said. "I actually do remember that trip. We drove up on a Friday night. You let me sit in the front seat even though I was probably too young, and Mom was furious about it." Richard looked at him. "I thought it was the best thing that had ever happened to me," Michael said, quietly. "At the time." He walked out into the corridor before Richard could respond, and the door swung closed behind him, and Richard Sterling sat alone in his room holding the photograph in both hands, looking at the boy in it, and feeling the full, specific weight of everything he had not been there for, and everything he still might be, if he chose to use the time he had left. Daniel arrived the following Tuesday with 2 coffees and a story he had not planned to tell. He had been going through some boxes in his apartment over the weekend. The task had begun as an attempt to find a specific pair of gloves and evolved, as such tasks tend to, into something more expansive. And he had come across a cardboard box that had lived in the back of his closet for 11 years without being opened. The label on it, in his own handwriting from when he moved into the apartment, said simply, "Army, keep." He had sat on the floor of his closet for almost an hour going through it. Inside were letters, photographs, a small notebook, 3 medals in their presentation cases, one of which he needed to clean with the cloth he kept in the bedside drawer for that purpose. There were also 3 envelopes, sealed with names written on the front, and he had not opened those. He knew what was in them. He had written them himself at different points during his service, because in his experience the men who said what they needed to say in advance tended to leave less unfinished behind them, and he had made himself do it each time, regardless of how much he did not want to. He had sat on the closet floor with the box on his lap and thought about the men whose faces were in the photographs. Thomas Greer, who had grown up in Mississippi and made a particular gesture with his hands when he was telling a story that Daniel had never seen anyone else do. Marcus Webb, who had been gifted at languages and picked up conversational ability in 3 different ones over the course of a single long deployment. Jimmy Okafor, who had carried a small laminated photograph of his wife and 2 daughters in the front chest pocket of his uniform for the entire length of every deployment and had shown it to Daniel the first week they served together, before Daniel knew him well, saying, "These are the people I'm coming back for. I show everyone so there are more people pulling for it." Jimmy had not come back. The photo had come back. Someone had mailed it to his wife. Daniel had thought about that for a long time, sitting on the closet floor. Then he had put everything back in the box, placed it on the chair by his bedroom window where he could see it, and gone to sleep. On Tuesday, he brought the box to the hospital. He was not entirely sure why. He knew only that it felt like the right thing to do, in the specific way that certain decisions arrive, not through analysis, but through a kind of clarity that bypasses the analytical process entirely, and he had learned to trust that kind of clarity. Richard was sitting up when he knocked. He had better color today. "Doctor." Parker had adjusted the medication protocol again, and Richard had told Daniel during the last visit that the side effects that had been most debilitating appeared to be moderating. He looked, not well exactly, but less carved down. More himself, whatever that meant. "You look like a man who slept," Daniel said. "I did, actually. Remarkable what medication adjustment can do." Richard looked at the box under Daniel's arm. "What's that?" "Something I found over the weekend." Danielle set the coffees on the table and put the box on the chair before sitting beside it. "I thought you might want to see some of it." He opened the box. He went through it methodically and without performance. He held up each photograph and gave a name and a sentence or two. Who the person was, where he had served alongside them. One specific thing he remembered about them that was concrete and particular rather than general. Thomas Greer and the way he told stories. Marcus and the languages. Jimmy and the photograph of his family. Richard listened without interrupting. He held each photograph when Daniel passed it to him, looked at it carefully, handed it back. When Daniel got to the letters, he did not pass those over. "These are letters I wrote to my daughter during different deployments," he said. "In case I didn't make it back." He held them. "She never had to read them. But you wrote them. Every time." Daniel set them back in the box. "Because the men I served with who didn't write things down, who didn't say things while they still could, left the people who loved them with nothing to hold on to, just silence and imagination." He looked at Richard. "Imagination is much worse. It fills itself in with the darkest available material." Richard was looking at the box. "You were prepared," he said, "for the possibility. You have to be, in that life." Daniel picked up his coffee. "It changes what you think is worth saying while you're still alive to say it." Richard did not respond immediately. He was looking at the window, where the November sky was doing something the sky in late November always did, which was nothing dramatic, just a steady gray persistence. "I have a will," he said. "Extremely thorough. I have estate planning documents, trust arrangements, shareholder agreements, letters of instruction to the board. Every contingency accounted for." He stopped. "But I have never written a letter to my sons that simply said what I actually felt about them, what I wished I had done differently, what I hoped for them." "Why not?" Daniel said. Richard turned to look at him. "Because when I imagine writing it, I imagine them reading it and not believing it. Because it comes too late. Because it is the kind of thing that sounds like a document designed to make myself feel better, rather than them." "Maybe," Daniel said. "Maybe it is that, partly. That doesn't make it worthless, doesn't it?" "No." Daniel set his cup down. When Jimmy Okafor's wife got that photograph back, it mattered to her. It wasn't everything she needed. It didn't make the loss smaller. But it was something that told her that the thing she believed about her marriage was real, that it was documented, that it happened. He paused. Even late documentation is documentation. It tells people that the thing you failed to say out loud, while you were occupied with all the other things you let crowded out, was nonetheless true. Richard was very still. "The letter doesn't have to be a defense of yourself," Daniel said. "It doesn't have to explain or justify anything. It can just be true. What you actually feel. What you would have done differently. What you see in them right now that you haven't said." "I wouldn't know where to begin," Richard said, quietly. The admission was not easy. Daniel could hear the specific texture of a man confronting the limits of an ability he had always assumed he possessed. "You begin at the beginning?" Daniel said. "You say, 'I want to tell you something true.'" Richard looked at him. "That's all," Daniel said. "That's the first line. Everything else follows from that." Outside, a gust of wind moved through the street, and the bare November trees in the small park across from the hospital bent and recovered. And Richard Sterling sat in his hospital room and thought about what it would mean, at this point, to begin telling the truth in the direction of the people who had grown up in his shadow, but not, to his lasting regret, in his presence. "I'd need paper," he said. "I'll ask the nurses," Daniel said. He was back in 3 minutes with a legal pad and 2 pens. He set them on Richard's tray table, and then, with the practiced tact of a man who understood what privacy was worth, he picked up his coffee and walked to the window and stood looking out at the street below. Richard picked up one of the pens. He looked at the blank top sheet of the legal pad for a long moment. Then, in the careful hand of a man who had spent decades signing documents that moved enormous sums of money and reshaped companies and defined markets, he wrote 6 words at the top of the page. Daniel did not watch him write. He stood at the window and looked at the street, and gave the man behind him the dignity of the moment. When Richard said, after a long time, "All right," Daniel turned around. He did not ask what was written. He simply sat back down, and the two of them drank their cooling coffee together. And Daniel told him about Thomas Greer and the time in a small village overseas when Greer had negotiated, through a combination of pantomime and absolute confident goodwill, the purchase of 3 chickens from a local family who did not share a single language with him. The transaction had taken 45 minutes and ended with everyone laughing. Richard laughed, not a polite laugh, a real one. It came out of him like something that had been stored for a while and finally found a way out. Daniel raised his coffee cup. Richard raised his. Outside, the November sky did exactly what it always did in this city at this time of year, which was nothing dramatic. Just pressed on, cold and gray, and absolutely indifferent to the particular human things happening underneath it, as skies tend to do. The letter to Michael took 3 days. Richard worked on it in the evenings after the regular business of the day. The medical checks, the brief visits from the investment management team, the call from his attorney about a filing deadline, had concluded. He wrote on the legal pad, crossed things out, rewrote, crossed out again. He threw away 5 pages. He started over from the beginning twice. Patricia, who came in for the 11 o'clock check on the second night and found him writing at midnight with the focused expression of a man working on something genuinely difficult, asked if he needed anything. "A better memory and a different 40 years, he said. She laughed. Then she said gently, "The writing is good for you, Mr. Sterling, whatever it is." He was not sure she was right about that in any straightforward sense. The process was not pleasant. It required him to look directly at specific moments. A particular graduation he had missed, because a deal in London required his presence. A summer he had promised would be different and was not. A conversation with a teenager who needed something from him and received instead a brief motivational speech about the long-term value of discipline, and to describe what he saw in them clearly, without revision. But Patricia might have been right in a different sense. Because on the 3rd evening, when he read back what he had written and found it to be, if not elegant, then at least honest, at least the actual truth of what he felt, without strategic framing or protective qualification, he experienced something that he could not quite name. A release of some kind. A very slight reduction in a pressure that had been present so long he had ceased to notice it as a specific sensation and accepted it simply as the ambient weather of his internal life. He folded the letter on the 4th day and put it in an envelope. Then he sat with the envelope in his hands for a while. Then he called Michael. "I wrote you a letter," he said when Michael answered. "I'd like to give it to you in person. When you come Thursday." A pause on the line. "A letter," Michael said. "On paper." "Yes." "Okay," Michael said. Then, carefully, "Is everything all right, medically?" "Parker says the numbers are stable," Richard said. "This is not about that. It's just something I wanted to say while I was in a position to say it clearly." Another pause. Longer. "All right," Michael said. "Thursday." "Thursday," Richard said. He set the phone down and realized, with the slight shock of recognizing something that has been present for a while without being acknowledged, that his hands were not entirely steady. On Thursday, Michael arrived at 5:15. He had come earlier, as he had said he would. He was carrying the briefcase, but also something else, a paper bag from a bakery on Lexington, containing 2 pieces of coffee cake, because he had remembered, from some conversation buried in the years, that his father had a particular weakness for coffee cake, and he had not known what else to do with the information. He set the bag on the table without comment. Richard looked at it. "Coffee cake," he said. "Don't read into it," Michael said. "I'm not," Richard said. He reached into the drawer of the bedside table and pulled out the envelope. He held it for a moment, and then he handed it to his son. Michael looked at it. His name was written on the front in his father's handwriting, which Michael had not seen in the context of anything personal in many years, mostly having encountered it on memos and notes passed through assistants. "Should I read it now?" he said. "If you want," Richard said. "Or later, either way." Michael looked at it for another moment. Then he sat down, opened the envelope, unfolded the letter, and read it. Richard watched his son's face. Michael read slowly. He was not a slow reader. Richard knew this, had always known it, one of the qualities he had registered and filed and never directly praised. But he read this slowly, the way you read something when you are trying to receive it, rather than process it. His expression changed several times, not dramatically. Michael Sterling had not had a dramatic face since approximately age 14, when he had learned to manage it into something more controlled. But the control, Richard noticed now, shifted and reasserted in ways that told a story. When he reached the last paragraph, his jaw tightened. When he finished and folded the letter, he sat holding it in both hands and looking at the wall across the room for a long moment. "You can't just," he said, and then stopped. Richard waited. "You can't write something like this and expect it to fix everything," Michael said. His voice was even, extremely even, the evenness of a man who is holding something at a very specific distance. "I don't expect it to fix anything," Richard said. "I expect it to be true. I expect it to tell you what is true, what I should have said a long time ago." He paused. "What I was unable to say, for reasons that do not reflect well on me." Michael looked at him. "It doesn't explain everything," Richard said. "It doesn't account for all of it. I know that." "No," Michael said. "It doesn't." "But it's true," Richard said. "Every word of it. You can decide what you do with it. I only wanted you to have it, to know that someone observed you clearly, that I observed you clearly, and found something worth saying." Michael put the letter carefully back in the envelope. He held the envelope. He looked at his father. He looked at him in the way that Richard had not seen him look since the boy in the photograph, that 12-year-old sitting beside a man in a Connecticut yard, back when the question of whether he was loved had not yet been answered in the particular cold way that years of absence tend to answer it. "Carter told you to write this," Michael said. "Not an accusation, just an accounting. He told me it mattered to say true things while I could still say them," Richard said. "The specific true things were mine." Michael put the envelope in his jacket pocket, on the side closest to his chest, with the unconscious care of someone stowing something valuable. He reached forward and picked up one of the pieces of coffee cake from the bag. "It's good," he said after a moment. "The one on Lexington." "I haven't had coffee cake in years," Richard said. Michael held out the other piece. Richard took it. They ate the coffee cake together in the late afternoon room, and the conversation that followed was not momentous or transformative. It was about small things. Michael's wife Rebecca's new position at the law firm, A restaurant recommendation Michael had, that he thought Richard might enjoy once he was well enough to go out. A mutual acquaintance who had sold a company for a notable figure, and the debate about whether the timing was right. Normal conversation? Ordinary? The kind of ordinary that is, in the right circumstances, a form of extraordinary precisely because it had, for a very long time, been completely unavailable to them. When Michael left at 7:30, he shook his father's hand. Then, after a moment, briefly, he put his other hand on top, both of his father's hands in his for a second. "I'll read it again at home," he said. "Take your time with it," Richard said. "I will." He picked up his briefcase. "Same time next week. Earlier if you want," Richard said. "I'm not going anywhere." Michael almost smiled. "I know," he said. He left, and Richard sat in the room alone, and for the first time since the diagnosis, he did not feel the weight of the solitude as something pressing down on him. The room was quiet. The coffee cake was good. The envelope was in his son's jacket pocket. He picked up his phone and sent a text to Daniel Carter. It said, "Thank you." Daniel texted back 3 minutes later. "How'd it go?" Richard typed, "He took the coffee cake home." A pause. Then Daniel's reply appeared. "That's the best possible outcome." Richard read this, and alone in his room, laughed. The conversation about the foundation happened on a Wednesday afternoon in December, when the first genuine cold of the season had arrived in Manhattan with the complete, unambiguous intent of staying. Daniel had brought gloves. He also brought, because he had taken a particular route that morning past a bookshop in the East Village that still somehow survived on the corner it had occupied since before Daniel was born, a paperback copy of a book he thought Richard might like. A memoir by a veteran who had gone on to do significant work in conflict mediation, a man Daniel had met briefly during a conference years earlier, and whose voice in print captured something Daniel found genuinely valuable. Richard was reading when he arrived. An actual book, which Daniel noted with approval. For the previous several weeks, Richard had been working through a stack of financial publications with the slightly guilty air of a man who cannot quite give himself permission to stop working even when working is not what is required. "What is it?" Daniel said, nodding at the book. Richard showed him. A biography of a Supreme Court justice he had never gotten around to reading. "Any good?" "Very," Richard said. "She was a more interesting person than the public record suggests." "They usually are," Daniel said. He put the memoir on the table. "When you're done with that." Richard picked it up, read the cover, read the author's name. "You know him?" "Met him once, at a conference in D.C. He has the specific quality of a person who has figured out what they are actually for." "What do you mean by that?" Daniel sat down. "Some people spend their whole lives trying on different purposes, trying on roles, accumulating positions and titles and achievements and still never quite landing on the thing that makes it feel like the time was well spent." He picked up his coffee. "He figured it out. You can hear it in everything he writes. Not smugly. He knows how lucky he was to get there. But you can feel it." Richard looked at the book. "What is he for?" "Helping people who have been through the worst things figure out how to live after it," Daniel said. "Specifically people who were involved in conflict, who did things or witnessed things that don't resolve cleanly." He paused. "He's built an organization that does actual, measurable work." "How large?" "Operations in 4 countries. Partnerships with veteran services in 7 states." Daniel set the book back on the table. He started it with $35,000 and a room borrowed from a church in Arlington. Richard looked at the book for a moment, then he set it down and looked at Daniel with the specific quality of attention that Daniel had come to recognize as Richard Sterling's signal that he was about to say something he had been thinking about for a while. "I have been thinking about my money," Richard said. "I figured," Daniel said. Richard looked at him sharply. "You figured. You're a man who built something large and is trying to figure out what it was for," Daniel said. "And you've been asking questions for weeks about what things people do that actually matter to other people. That's a particular kind of thinking trajectory." "You're very observant," Richard said, with something that in another man would have been annoyance, but in Richard had begun to carry the quality of a compliment. 22 years, Daniel said. It's useful. Richard nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, with the directness he brought to all of his most significant statements, I have more money than I or my children or my children's children will require. I have known this for a long time. I have managed it, grown it, allocated it to various investment vehicles and charitable vehicles in ways that were sensible and tax efficient and thoroughly reviewed by the right people. He stopped. But they were not personal. They were transactions. And you want something different, Daniel said. I want something that matters, Richard said. Not in the branding sense, not in the press release sense. He looked at Daniel steadily. You have spent years doing work for veterans. Work that is not glamorous and is not heavily resourced, and receives approximately no attention from anyone with serious capital. That's an accurate description. What would serious capital do for that work? Richard said. Specifically, in your experience. Daniel looked at him. He felt the weight of the question. The specific way a question can shift from theoretical to actual in a single moment. You're serious, he said. I am not known for imprecision, Richard said. Daniel put down his coffee cup. He sat back, looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of a man pulling up a filing system he did not expect to be using today. Then he looked at Richard. You want the honest answer? Always. Mental health services, Daniel said. The system is not equipped for what veterans come home carrying. The gap between what is available and what is needed is significant and has been significant for a long time. You could fund residential programs that actually work. Trained personnel. Long-term care rather than crisis-only intervention. What else? Education and professional reintegration. People who spent their 20s in uniform come home without the civilian credentials the professional world requires, and without the networks that most people in their position have built through college and early career. There are programs. They are underfunded. And the families, Richard said. It was not a question. He had been listening carefully. The families of the fallen, Daniel said. Financial support, yes, but also the work of helping people build lives after a loss that doesn't have a clean shape. Support systems. Community. He paused. There are organizations doing this work. They need resources, not just money. Operational resources. Strategic support. The kind of institutional backing that allows them to plan further than the next grant cycle. Richard was quiet. He was looking at the window. If you were designing this, he said. If you were setting up an organization with sufficient capitalization to do this work seriously, how would you structure it? Not as a vanity project, Daniel said immediately. Not named after you. Not organized around your image or legacy. He looked at Richard. Run by people who know the work. Advised by veterans and families. Transparent about how the money is used and what it actually produces. Richard nodded slowly. That would be the condition, he said. Yes, Daniel said. And you? Richard said. Would you be involved? The question landed in the room and sat there. I'm not a non-profit administrator, Daniel said carefully. I'm a retired master sergeant who volunteers twice a week. I'm not asking for your title, Richard said. I'm asking whether the people running the foundation could call you when they needed someone who understood the actual human reality of what they were trying to serve. He paused. And whether you would tell them honestly when they were getting it wrong. Daniel looked at him for a long moment. I would do that, he said. Yes. Then we would call it advisory participation, Richard said. He reached for the notepad on his tray table. I'm going to call my attorneys tomorrow and begin the process of setting up a structure. I want you to meet with them next week and tell them what you told me today. The specifics. They will listen. He looked up. This is not a small gesture, Daniel. I am talking about a significant portion of what I have. There will be a board, there will be legal structures, there will be operational oversight. It will take time to do it right, Daniel said. Yes, Richard said, which is one of the reasons I am starting now. He set the pen down. He looked at Daniel with the direct, clear gaze of a man who has made a decision and is at peace with it. I have spent my life making things larger. Buildings, companies, portfolios. I have been very good at it. He paused. I would like to spend what remains of the time I have making something meaningful. Those are not always the same project. Daniel said nothing for a moment. Outside, the cold December wind moved through the bare street trees, and the city went about its enormous, indifferent business around the hospital. And in room 1116, two men sat together in the particular quiet of a decision that has just been made, and will take the rest of a life to carry out. "One condition from me," Daniel said. "Name it. The first programs funded are operational before any announcement is made," Daniel said. "No press event, no unveiling, no announcement until actual people have been served. The organization earns its credibility through work, not through press coverage." Richard looked at him. "If that's not acceptable," Daniel said. "It is entirely acceptable," Richard said. "In fact, it is exactly right." He picked up the pen again. "I will add it to the initial terms." Daniel picked up his coffee. Richard picked up his. They drank together in the cold December light, and the paperback memoir sat on the table between them, and outside the window, the city pressed on in every direction, full of people who needed things that the world had not yet figured out how to reliably provide. The attorneys arrived on Friday morning, 3 of them, from the firm that had served Sterling Capital Group for 14 years, carrying briefcases and the composed professional energy of people who understood that when Richard Sterling wanted something done, the appropriate response was focused competence, rather than questions about whether it was a good idea. Richard had spoken to them on the phone for 40 minutes the previous evening. By the time they walked in, they had already begun preliminary research on the most effective organizational structures for a large-scale private foundation focused on veterans support services. Daniel arrived at 10, as Richard had asked him to, wearing a collared shirt and his better jacket rather than the olive one, because he understood that this was a different kind of conversation than the ones they had been having, and certain things deserved the right framing even between people who understood that framing was not the point. He sat across from the attorneys and spoke for 90 minutes. He was precise. He gave them specific names of organizations already doing the work, their structures, their funding gaps, their operational strengths, the specific points where resources would have maximum effect. He described the mental health landscape for returning veterans with the specificity of someone who had spent years moving through that landscape and knew which doors were locked and which were simply stuck from disuse. He described the professional reintegration gap not in the abstract, but with examples, faces, individual cases he had been close to. The attorneys took notes. The lead attorney, a woman named Claire Whitman, who had probably heard more sophisticated presentations from more decorated sources, and who nonetheless was writing with the focused efficiency of someone receiving genuinely useful information, looked up at one point and said, "How long have you been working in this space?" "Voluntarily, 11 years, Daniel said. "Before that, 22 years in uniform." She nodded and went back to writing. Richard sat at the edge of the conversation, contributing occasionally with the sharply targeted questions of a man who understood institutional structures and had built enough of them to know the pressure points. But mostly he listened, and Daniel noticed that he was watching the attorneys' faces with the particular satisfaction of someone seeing a plan become real in real time. After the attorneys left, Richard looked at Daniel and said, "You should have been doing this work at scale years ago." "I did it at the scale that was available to me," Daniel said. "Now a larger scale is available." "I know." Daniel picked up his jacket from the chair. "It changes things. Is that all right with you?" Daniel considered this genuinely. The question was real. Richard was asking whether the expansion changed something about the work that made it less valuable, whether the introduction of resources and organizational structure altered the nature of what Daniel had been doing in a way that might hollow it out. "It's all right," Daniel said, "as long as we stay honest about what the work is actually for." He put on the jacket. "The moment it becomes about the organization rather than the people, you tell me and I'll tell you." "Agreed," Richard said. Michael had been brought into the foundation planning on Wednesday evening in a conversation that Richard had told Daniel about afterward. Michael had listened to the full outline of the plan, asked several pointed operational questions that revealed he had been thinking about the details more carefully than his composure suggested, and then said, "This is good. This is the right thing to do with it." Richard had told Daniel this the following morning in a text that contained, for the first time, an unprompted note of something that read like straightforward happiness. Not complicated, not measured, not hedged. Just, he said it was the right thing to do. I think he meant it. Daniel had texted back. He did. He did not know this for certain, but he suspected it was true. On the second Wednesday of December, Dr. Parker stopped Daniel in the corridor as he was leaving. "Mr. Carter," she said. He stopped. She had the look of a person who has been weighing whether to say something and has decided to go ahead. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Professionally." "All right," he said. "What changed for him?" She said it directly, without preliminary. "In the last month, whatever you've been doing, the visits, the conversations, something has changed for him. His physical response to treatment has improved measurably. The psychological profile we track has shifted in a direction I was not expecting." She paused. "I've been practicing for 18 years, and I try not to make causal claims I can't support. But I notice things." Daniel thought about how to answer this honestly. "I don't know that I did anything specific," he said. "I sat with him. I asked him questions. I told him things about my experience." He paused. "I think possibly the thing that changed is that someone was treating him like a person rather than a patient or a portfolio." Dr. Parker looked at him for a moment. "That sounds simple." "It usually does," Daniel said, "until you need it and discover how rarely it's available." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What you're doing matters. I wanted you to know that someone with clinical judgment agrees." "Thank you," Daniel said. "I'll keep coming." "Please do," she said, and went back down the corridor with the purposeful step of a person with 17 other things requiring immediate attention. On the third Thursday of December, Christopher Sterling flew in from Portland. No one had specifically expected this. Michael had called him twice in the previous month and reported to Richard that the conversations had been brief and unrevealing. But on a Thursday morning, Christopher arrived at Meridian Medical Center with a rolling carry-on bag and the look of someone who has been building up to something for a while and finally ran out of reasons not to do it. He was 38 years old, darker than Michael, with their father's jawline and their mother's eyes. He worked in landscape architecture, a career choice that Richard had never directly criticized, but had also never directly engaged with in any meaningful way. A form of indifference that Christopher had understood as dismissal. He was in his father's room for 3 hours. Daniel did not know the content of what passed between them. He learned afterward from Richard that the first hour had been the most difficult. Christopher had things to say, and unlike Michael, he did not manage them into controlled delivery, but brought them out in the direct, sometimes sharp way of a person who had been waiting to be heard and was going to be heard now. Richard had listened. He had not defended himself. He had not explained. He had asked questions about what Christopher remembered and what it had felt like from inside, and he had listened to the answers with the specific quality of a person who finally understands that listening is not a concession, but an act. Christopher, Richard told Daniel, had cried. Once at a specific point in the conversation, when Richard said something direct and true about what he had failed to give him, and Richard had put his hand on his younger son's arm and left it there. He had told Daniel, "I did not know how to comfort him when he was small. I was uncomfortable with it. I didn't have a model for it." He paused. "I found out today that I am less uncomfortable with it than I was. It turns out the discomfort is mostly about starting. Once you've started, it is simply..." He stopped, looking for the word. "Human." "Yes," Daniel said. "He's going to stay in the city for a week," Richard said. "He's going to come back tomorrow." "Good," Daniel said. "I showed him the photograph," Richard said. "The one from Connecticut." "What did he say?" "He said he remembered that trip. He said I let Michael sit in the front seat and he was furious about it." Richard paused. "He said he remembered being furious, and then I made him laugh at something, and after that it was fine." Daniel looked at him. "I have no memory of making him laugh," Richard said, "but apparently I did. Maybe you were better at it than you thought," Daniel said. Richard was quiet for a moment, holding that thought. "Maybe," he said. Outside, the December city moved in its particular winter way, purposeful, coated, leaning into the cold with the resigned determination of people who understand that the cold is going to be here for a while, and the reasonable response is to carry on. The ceremony was small. That had been the condition, and Richard had held to it. It took place in late February, on a Saturday afternoon, in one of the conference rooms on the hospital's third floor, a room normally used for family consultations and medical briefings, which Patricia had arranged to have set up with chairs and a small table, and a modest arrangement of flowers that someone had brought without anyone asking. The window looked out over the park, where the trees were still bare, but the quality of light had shifted from the absolute certainty of winter toward something with slightly more negotiation in it. Richard was there in a wheelchair. He had, over the previous 2 months, had 3 weeks of marked improvement, followed by a more difficult period. And Dr. Parker was recalibrating again with the careful persistence of a physician who understood that this was the nature of the disease and that the work was to manage it rather than defeat it outright. He was thinner than he had been in November, but he was present, and his eyes were clear. And when he spoke with the directness and precision that had always been his primary mode. Michael was there, seated to his father's right with Rebecca beside him, a composed woman with an open, intelligent face who had come in from New Jersey and who, upon meeting Daniel in the corridor outside, had said, "He talks about you. More than you probably realize." Daniel had said he was glad to hear it. Christopher was there as well. He had come back to New York twice more since the December visit, and each time had stayed longer. He and Richard had not resolved everything. Daniel understood enough about these dynamics to know that resolution was not a destination, but a practice, something you did continuously rather than completed. But they had established something, a line of communication that had, at one point, not existed. Something neither of them was going to let go of in a hurry. Sarah had driven up from Queens. She was sitting in the row behind her father, and she had brought, without announcing it, a small container of the specific coffee cake from the Bronx bakery she knew her father preferred, which she set on the table with the brisk competence of a woman who has made a decision and is implementing it. Thomas Whitfield was there, in a chair near the wall, his hip now sufficiently recovered that he could navigate the room without assistance, though he had declined to do so without his cane. He had heard about the foundation through the Veterans Support Network, and had called Daniel twice to ask pointed questions about the governance structure, because Thomas was the kind of man who asked pointed questions about governance structures, and Daniel had spent 20 minutes on each call, answering them patiently and honestly. Claire Whitman, the attorney, was present with a folder of documents that represented 6 weeks of legal work. The foundation was formally established. The initial capitalization, a figure that, when Daniel had first heard it stated plainly, had required a moment of simply sitting still, had been transferred and was under management. The board had been constituted, with 5 members who collectively had deep expertise in nonprofit governance, veterans services, mental health care, and educational programming. Daniel's name was on the advisory document under the title that Richard had ultimately decided on: Senior Advisor, Mission Integrity. Richard had proposed the title himself. "It means what it says," he had told Daniel. "Your role is to tell us when we are drifting from what actually matters. You'll get tired of hearing it," Daniel had said. "No," Richard had said. "I will not." The ceremony itself was simple. There was no press, no cameras, no speeches prepared in advance and vetted by communications teams. Richard had asked for that, and everyone had honored it. Richard spoke first. He spoke for perhaps 10 minutes, without notes. He talked about what he had spent his life building and what he had discovered, at 72 years old in a hospital room in Manhattan, about the relationship between what you accumulate and what you actually have. He talked about the men whose photographs Daniel had shown him, and what it meant that Daniel still carried those photographs. He talked about the particular form of poverty that can exist alongside enormous material wealth, which is the poverty of never having learned to say true things to the people who matter to you while you are still in a position to say them. He did not make it sound like a lesson learned cleanly. He was too precise for that. He described it as the particular kind of growth that is only available to a person who has first failed significantly and understood, eventually, what they failed at. Then he looked at Daniel. "There's a piece I want you to have," he said. He nodded to Claire Whitman, who brought a wrapped frame from behind the table and handed it to Daniel. Daniel unwrapped it. It was a photograph. A clear one. Taken in this hospital, in this room, at some point during the early visits. He did not know who had taken it. In it, 2 men were sitting in the amber light of a hospital room, one in a bed, one in a chair beside it, both leaning slightly toward each other with the unconscious posture of people engaged in a conversation that matters. The man in the bed was Richard, and the man in the chair was Daniel, and both of them appeared to be laughing. Daniel looked at it for a long moment. "Do you know who took this?" he said. "Patricia," Richard said, "on the 3rd visit. I asked her to, and she managed it without either of us noticing." Daniel looked up at him. "The first evening you came in," Richard said, "and sat down without knowing who I was and talked to me for 40 minutes like I was simply a person. That was the first time in a long time anyone had done that. I wanted a record of it." He paused. "Because I knew that night that something was going to change. I didn't know what. I just knew the direction." Daniel held the photograph. "That night," he said, "I knocked on your door because you had the look of someone who had been alone for too long." He paused. "I recognize it. I had it myself once, for a while after my last deployment." He held the photograph carefully. "You were simply a person in a room who needed company." "Yes," Richard said. "That's all I saw," Daniel said. "I know," Richard said. "That's exactly why it worked." Sarah was watching her father from the row behind him, with the particular expression of a person witnessing something that tells them something true about who their parent is. She had known for a long time that her father was a good man, but goodness and knowledge of goodness are different things. And watching him hold this photograph with the careful hands of a man who understands what he is holding, she filed that away. Michael, beside his father's wheelchair, put his hand briefly on his father's shoulder. Christopher, on the other side of the room, was looking at the window with his arms folded, but he was not closed off. Daniel, who read posture the way some people read text, could see that he was simply processing, which was different. The afternoon light moved across the floor of the conference room in the slow, particular way of February light in New York, which is different from any other kind. Thinner, more deliberate, arriving at a lower angle and staying close to the ground, as though it too understands that the cold season is not quite done and is not going to pretend otherwise. Thomas Whitfield said, from his chair near the wall, "When do the first programs launch?" "March," Claire Whitman said. "The pilot mental health program in New Jersey is on schedule." Thomas nodded. "I'd like to see the report. I'll make sure you receive it," she said. "All right," Thomas said. He settled back in his chair with the comfortable authority of a man who has made his intentions clear and considers the matter appropriately arranged. The coffee cake was distributed. The conversation became general. Practical questions about the Foundation's first programs, a brief discussion of the advisory structure, Thomas offering an opinion about governance that was technically within the scope of his role as a guest, but was received by everyone present with the respect due to a man who has earned his opinions through experience. Richard sat at the center of it and said relatively little. He had said what he needed to say. He watched the room, his 2 sons in the same space, present and engaged. Sarah Carter filling cups with the proprietary ease of someone who has adopted a situation. Thomas arguing a governance point with the Foundation's attorney, with the comfortable persistence of a man who has argued his way through harder rooms. And Daniel, across the table, listening to Thomas with the patient attention that Daniel brought to every conversation, the quality that had made Richard trust him on the second visit, and had not given him reason to revise that trust in the months since. Richard had said in his remarks that the truest measure of a life was not what you built, but what you left standing in the lives of others after you were gone. He had said it, and meant it, and had felt, as he said it, the specific complexity of a man who has arrived at a truth too late to act on it fully, but not too late to act on it at all. He looked at Daniel. Daniel looked back at him. Between them, across the small table in the conference room on the third floor of Meridian Medical Center, something passed that did not require language. The particular understanding that exists between two people who have sat with each other in the dark and said true things and found, on the other side of it, that the truth was not as destructive as either of them had been afraid it might be. Richard raised his cup of coffee. Daniel raised his. Outside, the February city continued its enormous, improbable project, and the trees in the park stood bare but not broken in the pale afternoon light. And somewhere in New Jersey, a small office was being set up with chairs and a desk and a phone, and the particular intent of being the first visible piece of something that would, over the coming years, touch more lives than any of the people in this room could yet imagine. But they did not need to imagine it. They had begun it. That was enough for today. And that, in the end, is the whole of what the story had to say. That you can spend a lifetime accumulating everything the world considers valuable and still arrive, at the end, holding very little that actually matters. But you can also, if someone knocks on your door at the right moment, in the right rain, with no agenda and a cup of coffee, find your way back to what does. Not easily, not completely, not without cost, but you can find it. And that finding, however late it comes, is not nothing. It is, in fact, everything.